The flowers arrived before the frost did. 40 stems of white hellebore and trailing ivy, arranged in the grand entrance hall of Ravensmore estate by hands that had been working since before dawn. The chandelier above the staircase had been cleaned crystal by crystal. The silver on the dining table caught the afternoon light and held it like a secret. Every corner of the estate breathed with the particular anxiety of a house that knew it was being watched by its master, by his guests, and by history itself. Maria Morris noticed all of it. She was trained too. She moved through the preparations the way water moves through a familiar channel, purposefully, quietly, disturbing nothing. She directed the junior maids on the placement of the floral arrangements, checked the candlesticks for even wicking, and pressed 2 fingers to a tablecloth to confirm it had been ironed to the correct tension. These were not small things. In a house like Ravensmore, the small things were the architecture of everything else. The occasion was the formal engagement announcement of Edmund Ashford, 8th Duke of Ravensmore, to Lady Isolde Fairchurch of the Wiltshire Fairchurches. It was the kind of union that did not require love to be considered successful. It required bloodlines, compatible estates, and the approval of people whose opinions were treated as whether inevitable, impersonal, impossible to argue with. Society had been expecting this match for 2 years. The Duke had delayed it for 2 years. That, too, was noted. Maria had been at Ravensmore for 14 months. She had come in October of the previous year with 3 letters of reference, 2 of which were genuine, and a composure so complete that Mrs. Holt, the head housekeeper, had hired her within the quarter hour. She was efficient. She was silent in the way that good servants were silent, present without imposing, aware without appearing to listen. She learned the estate quickly, which floorboards announced themselves, which doors required a particular firmness, which rooms the Duke preferred cold and which he wanted warm without being asked. She also learned the library. She did not use it improperly, not at first. She dusted its shelves with the same precision she brought to everything, and if her eyes moved along the spines of the ledgers on the upper shelf, the estate records, the legal correspondence, the bound journals of the 7th Duke, it appeared to anyone watching as nothing more than thoroughness. She was thorough. That part was not a performance. Her father's name was Thomas Morris. He had been a gentleman scholar of modest but legitimate estate in Shropshire, a man who had spent his better years cataloguing botanical specimens and corresponding with naturalists across the continent. He had also, at the wrong moment in his life, trusted the wrong man. The wrong man had been Edmund's father. The details were long and legal and deliberately obscured, which was itself a kind of detail. What Maria knew was the shape of it: a land agreement manipulated through a proxy solicitor, a signature obtained under false representation, and an estate transferred by the time her father understood what had happened. The courts had not helped. Men like the 7th Duke did not lose in courts. Her father had died 3 years ago in rented rooms, still writing letters that no one answered, still believing that truth had an institutional address. Maria had stopped believing that. But she had not stopped looking. She was crossing the upper corridor with a stack of pressed linens when she heard the voices through the study door. She would not have paused. She was not the kind of woman who paused at closed doors, except that she recognized the tightness in the Duke's voice, the specific register he used when he was being pressed on something he did not wish to examine. "You don't want this," Lord Callum Drew was saying. His tone was not unkind. He was perhaps the only man in England who spoke to Edmund Ashford without calculation. "What I want," Edmund replied, "is for this conversation to end." "She is a cold woman, Edmund, correct in every particular and cold in all of them. Warmth is not a requirement of a successful marriage. It is a romantic fantasy propagated by people with too much time and insufficient responsibility." A pause, the sound of a chair. Then Callum again, quieter. "Then what is your requirement? What would you actually choose if the title and the expectation and your father's voice in your head were removed from the equation?" The silence that followed was long enough that Maria should have moved. She did not. "Anything other than this," Edmund said finally. His voice had shifted into something less managed. "I'd rather marry my maid than chain myself to a woman who calculates every breath. At least the maid is honest." It was said as dismissal, as frustration, as the careless hyperbole of a man who did not believe anyone was listening. Maria moved. She continued down the corridor with the linens held against her chest, her footsteps precise, and even her face arranged in the particular neutrality she had perfected over 14 months of careful work. She did not flush. She did not falter. She turned the corner and she kept walking until she reached the linen cupboard, and she set the stack down on the shelf, and she stood in the small, close dark of it for exactly 4 breaths. Then she went back to work. The dinner was everything the occasion required. Lady Isolde Fairchurch sat at the Duke's right hand in ivory silk and diamonds, her posture a masterwork of breeding, her conversation precisely calibrated to include everyone and reveal nothing. She was, Maria observed while refilling the crystal, extraordinarily beautiful in the way that certain architectural facades were beautiful, imposing, immaculate, designed to be looked at rather than entered. The Duke was elsewhere, physically present, impeccably dressed, fulfilling every obligation of the evening and entirely absent behind the eyes. He reached for his wine glass and his gaze crossed the room and found Maria for one unguarded moment. She did not look away first. He did. She found the letter at 11:30. She had returned to the library to retrieve a candelabra left behind by one of the junior maids, a legitimate errand, a documented reason to be in the room. She was replacing the candelabra when her elbow caught the edge of a leather ledger on the lower shelf, and it fell, and from between its pages slipped a folded envelope, unsealed, addressed in the 7th Duke's handwriting to a solicitor whose name Maria recognized the way you recognize the face of someone who has done you harm. She stood for a moment in the candlelight, the letter in her hands. She read it. It was not exoneration. It was something more ambiguous and therefore more useful, an acknowledgement, indirect and self-protective, that the Morris matter had been managed outside the ordinary channels, that the agreement should not be examined too closely, and that the relevant documents were held in the Lower East Archive of Ravensmore. A thread. Maria folded it carefully. She placed it in the pocket of her apron. She straightened the ledger on the shelf, collected the candelabra, and walked out of the library with measured steps. She told no one. Outside, the first frost of autumn was settling over Ravensmore, quiet and indifferent, covering everything in white. Winter arrived at Ravensmore the way grief arrives, gradually, and then all at once. The grounds hardened. The sky closed itself into a permanent gray ceiling that pressed down over the estate like a held breath. The staff moved in tighter patterns, conserving warmth, speaking in shorter sentences. 3 months had passed since the engagement dinner, and Lady Isolde Fairchurch had taken to visiting the estate with increasing frequency, each visit longer than the last, each one leaving a faint residue of tension in the room she had occupied, the way certain perfumes linger in fabric long after the wearer has gone. She had not yet moved in. She was already everywhere. Maria observed this without opinion. Or she permitted herself no opinion, which was a different thing entirely, and she knew the difference. She continued her work with the same precision she had always brought to it, managing the junior staff, coordinating with Mrs. Holt, maintaining the invisible machinery that kept a house of this size from collapsing under its own weight. If she thought about the letter in the locked box beneath her bed, she thought about it only at night, when thinking cost nothing. It was a Tuesday when Lady Isolde first made her move. The occasion was minor, a misdirected arrangement of the morning room furniture that Isolde had not ordered and did not approve of. She summoned Maria directly, bypassing Mrs. Holt entirely, which was itself a statement. Maria stood at the center of the morning room while Lady Isolde circled it, gesturing at the repositioned chairs with the particular displeasure of a woman who understood that domestic control was its own form of power. "You moved these without instruction," Isolde said. "Mrs. Holt directed the arrangement for the afternoon light, my lady. It is standard winter practice at Ravensmore. I am shortly to be the mistress of Ravensmore. My preferences supersede winter practice. Yes, my lady, I will inform Mrs. Holt. Isolde stopped circling. She looked at Maria with the focused attention she rarely aimed at servants, the kind of look that was actually an assessment. You are very composed, she said. It was not a compliment. I find it useful, my lady. The room was rearranged before noon. Edmund had been present for none of it. This, too, was noted. The storm came 4 days later. It descended without the courtesy of gradual warning, a wall of weather moving across the northern hills and arriving at Ravensmore in the early afternoon with enough force to render the road to the village impassable by nightfall. The estate sealed itself. The guest list reduced to those already inside. Edmund, Lady Isolde, Lord Callum Drew, Mrs. Holt, and the skeleton staff that managed the interior. Maria among them. Enforced proximity is its own kind of revelation. Without the buffer of a full household, the constant movement, the noise, the social performance that a larger gathering permitted, the inhabitants of Ravensmore were left with each other and themselves. Isolde played the pianoforte in the evenings with technical perfection. Callum read and made dry observations that Edmund half smiled at. Edmund moved through the estate with the restlessness of a man who had forgotten how to be still. He began appearing in rooms where Maria was working, not seeking her out. She did not flatter herself with that interpretation, not then. But where another employer would have redirected himself, Edmund stayed. He stood at the window of the east sitting room while she reorganized the bookshelf, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable in the way silences between a duke and a housemaid ought to have been. It was something closer to the silence between two people who are tired of performing. Once he said, "Do you find the storm inconvenient?" "No more than convenience is ever guaranteed, Your Grace." He looked at her. "That is either very wise or very resigned." "Most wisdom begins as resignation," she said. "My lady requires the east sitting room at 3 o'clock." She left. He remained at the window. She was in the restricted library on a Thursday evening when he found her. She had been careful. She was always careful. But the thread she had pulled in October had led to another, and that one to another, and the Lower East Archive Mrs. Holt never unlocked had finally yielded to a key that Maria had spent 2 weeks locating. The documents were exactly where the letter had indicated. Her father's name was in them, written in the clean, indifferent hand of a man recording a transaction rather than destroying a life. The door opened. Edmund stood in the frame, a lamp in one hand, his expression moving through surprise into something harder. His eyes went to the open archive, to the documents in her hands, to her face. "This room is restricted to staff," he said. "I know. But those are estate records." "They are." She did not put them down. She did not step back. She held his gaze with the steadiness that had carried her through 14 months of careful, deliberate waiting and said, "Your father destroyed mine. I came here for proof of it. These documents are that proof. I will leave Ravensmore tonight if you require it, but I will not stand here and pretend I was doing something shameful." The lamp threw long shadows across the shelves. Edmund said nothing for a long moment. His jaw was set. His eyes moved to the documents and stayed there. "Get out of this room," he said quietly. She gathered the papers. He did not stop her. He did not call for Mrs. Holt. He stood in the doorway while she walked past him, and he said nothing further, and she did not look back, and the library door clicked shut behind her like a full stop at the end of a sentence that had taken years to write. That night, Edmund pulled his father's records himself. The accusation came on a Saturday morning, before the storm had fully cleared. Isolde had found her moment with surgical precision. The assembled household gathered in the entrance hall following breakfast, the timing ensuring maximum witness. Her voice was measured and devastating. A brooch missing from her dressing table, a servant seen near her rooms without instruction, an implication constructed from suggestion and delivered as fact. Maria stood at the center of it as she had stood in the morning room, still, straight, silent. Edmund listened from the foot of the stairs. His expression was unreadable. "I would ask that the matter be investigated thoroughly," Isolde concluded, her eyes briefly on Edmund, "before any conclusions are drawn in either direction." Edmund looked at Maria. Maria looked at Edmund. 1 second passed, then another. He said, "Pending investigation, Miss Morris will stand down from her duties." Maria inclined her head precisely. "Of course, Your Grace." She looked at no one else. She walked to the servants' staircase with her spine straight and her hands relaxed at her sides, and she did not permit a single thing she was feeling to surface until she reached her room and closed the door. And even then, she sat on the edge of her bed in complete stillness for a very long time. She did not weep. There was no version of this that weeping improved. He reinstated her the following morning. He came to Mrs. Holt directly after breakfast before Isolde had descended, and he said, "Miss Morris is to resume her full duties immediately." Mrs. Holt, who understood everything and confirmed nothing, said simply, "Yes, Your Grace." When Isolde found him in the study and demanded explanation, Edmund set down his pen and looked at her with the particular clarity of a man who has spent a night reading damning evidence about his own bloodline. "Because I was wrong," he said. "That is sufficient reason." Isolde's composure held. It was excellent composure, but something behind it shifted, a recalibration, cold and quiet, and she left the room without another word. Edmund turned back to his desk. The engagement was not yet broken, but the man who had made it was no longer entirely certain who he was, and that uncertainty, though it felt like damage, was in fact the first honest thing he had experienced in a very long time. He fell from his horse on a Wednesday. There was no dramatic cause, no spooked animal, no reckless speed. The Duke of Ravensmore simply lost consciousness somewhere along the frost-hardened bridle path that crossed the eastern boundary of the estate, and the horse, a steady gray gelding with more sense than most men Edmund knew, stopped walking and stood over him until the groom found them both 40 minutes later in the failing afternoon light. Dr. Fenwick arrived within the hour. He examined Edmund in silence, asked 3 precise questions, and then asked everyone else to leave the room. When he emerged, his face carried the particular arrangement of a man who has accurate information and no pleasant way to deliver it. He took Mrs. Holt aside first, then Lord Callum. Then, because protocol demanded it, he informed Lady Isolde, who received the news with perfect stillness and said the correct things in the correct order without a tremor in her voice. Acute peritonitis advanced. Surgery required within 24 hours. The surgery itself carried considerable risk. The alternative carried more. Edmund, when told, was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like one person to remain with me tonight, before the procedure." Callum stepped forward immediately. Isolde moved to speak. Edmund said, "Send for Maria Morris." The silence that followed that sentence was its own kind of verdict. Isolde's composure held, it always held, but the quality of it changed, calcifying into something that was no longer poise but its precise imitation. Callum said nothing, which was his particular form of loyalty. Mrs. Holt went to fetch Maria without a word, because Mrs. Holt understood that the most important things in a house were rarely the things spoken aloud. Maria came without asking why. She entered the room where Edmund lay propped against the pillows, diminished by fever but not yet defeated by it, and she pulled the chair to the bedside and she sat down, and she did not arrange her face into sympathy or professional distance or any of the expressions available to a woman in her position. She simply looked at him the way she had always looked at him, directly, without agenda, without the performance of any feeling she did not actually have. "You didn't have to come," Edmund said. His voice was rough. "You sent for me," Maria replied. "That is sufficient reason." He recognized his own words in hers. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, arriving and departing before it could be named. The fire burned low. Outside, Ravensmore was entirely still, the grounds locked under deep winter, the sky pressed flat and dark against the windows. Edmund lay in the half-light, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, He had no performance left in him. The fever had burned through his reserves. The prospect of the morning had dissolved every pretense he had maintained for 20 years of dukedom. He began to speak. He told her about his father, not the version in the ledgers, she knew that version. He told her the human version, the one that had no archive. A man of enormous pride and absolute certainty, who had impressed upon his only son from the earliest possible age that weakness was the one unforgivable failing. That sentiment was for people without responsibilities, that the Ashford name was a structure that required constant maintenance and constant sacrifice, and would consume everything soft in you if you let it, and that this was not tragedy but duty. Edmund had believed him. He had organized his entire life around believing him. "I wore the dukedom the way a man wears armor into a room with no enemies," he said, "and then I could not remember how to take it off." Maria listened. She did not fill the pauses. She did not redirect him toward comfort. She simply received what he said without flinching and without embellishment, and this specific quality of her attention, was the thing he had been orbiting for 14 months without the vocabulary to name it. Then he told her about her father's estate. He told her quietly, without ceremony, watching her face as he spoke. 3 weeks ago, before the illness, before any of this, he had contacted his solicitor privately and initiated the legal process to restore the Morris estate. The fraudulent transfer, thoroughly documented in his father's own hand, was already being unwound through the appropriate channels. Her father's name would be formally rehabilitated. The land would be returned. He had told no one. He had expected nothing from it. He had done it in the way you settle a debt when the creditor is no longer living to receive payment, because the debt exists regardless, and because a man who knows the truth and does nothing with it is simply his father wearing a different coat. Maria was very still. She was not a woman given to visible undoing. She had proven that conclusively across months of provocation and loss and deliberate humiliation. But something moved across her face in the firelight, something that was not grief and not gratitude, but was perhaps what lives beneath both of those things, in the place where a person has been quietly carrying weight for so long that the sudden removal of it feels almost like falling. She reached out and took his hand. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them named what the silence contained. Edmund closed his eyes with her hand in his, and the fever moved through him like a tide, and somewhere beneath the fear of the morning he felt, for the first time in a very long time, that he was precisely where he was supposed to be. He survived the surgery. The recovery was slow and ungraceful, and nothing like the dignified convalescence that Ravensmore's history might have preferred. He was irritable with the physician, impatient with his own weakness, and entirely incapable of the bed rest prescribed. Mrs. Holt managed him with the authority of a woman who had outlasted 3 generations of Ashford pride and intended to outlast a 4th. Isolde visited once. She came on the 5th day, impeccably dressed, perfectly measured in her concern. She sat across the room in the chair that was not beside the bed, and she said the correct things and asked the correct questions, and Edmund watched her and understood, with the terrible clarity that illness sometimes delivers, that she did not want to know how he was. She wanted to confirm that the inheritance remained intact and the situation remained manageable. She did not ask what he was feeling. She did not reach across the space between them. She left after 20 minutes. Edmund stared at the ceiling for a long time after she had gone. He ended the engagement on a Friday. He did it privately, correctly, without public theater. There was social cost. There was always social cost, and he bore it without explanation to those who demanded one. To Callum, alone by the fire one evening, he said only, "I almost died, and the only face I wanted was the one I had dismissed as beneath me. That is not a man I intend to remain." Callum poured him a drink and said nothing, which was the most eloquent response available. Maria was at the door on a gray Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. Her bag was packed. Her father's estate matter was resolved, her reason for Ravensmore complete. She had submitted her formal resignation to Mrs. Holt the previous evening with the same composure she had brought to everything, clean, complete, no loose edges. She had said goodbye to no one, because goodbyes invited conversation, and she did not trust herself with conversation. Not here. Not now. The entrance hall was empty in the early light except for Edmund. He was not dressed for the day. He stood at the foot of the staircase in his shirt sleeves, which was undignified by every standard Ravensmore had ever held, and he looked at her bag and then at her face, and he did not command and he did not perform. He said, "I said once I'd rather marry my maid. I did not know then that I meant it, or that she would be the finest person in any room she ever entered. I am asking, not as your employer. I am asking as a man who has very little pride left and considers that an improvement." The gray light held them both. Outside, Ravensmore was winter still, waiting. Maria looked at him for a long moment, at this man who had been arrogant and wrong and slow, and in the end, honest in the way that costs something. She thought of her father's letters that no one answered. She thought of 14 months of careful invisibility. She thought of a hand held in the dark before a surgery that might have ended everything, and how neither of them had needed to explain it. She set down her bag. The sound it made against the stone floor was very small. It was also, in every way that mattered, enormous. He had called her his maid as if it were an insult. She had always known it was not. What neither of them knew, until the winter nearly took him, was that it had never been her station he was naming. It had been his fear.